twelfth emissary and the first Gentile. Last Shabbat, we considered the encounter Sha'ul had with Yeshua and the outcome that followed. This man Sha'ul is my chosen instrument to carry my name to the Goyim and also to the sons of Israel as well. By calling Sha'ul his chosen instrument, it appears to have been Yeshua's way of saying that he was going to be the 12th emissary. Later, Sha'ul opens his letter to the Romans with a greeting from Sha'ul, a slave of Messiah, Yeshua, an emissary, because I was called and set apart for God, for the good news of God. Then later, in Romans 11 verse 13, he says, to those of you who are Gentiles, I say this, myself, I am an emissary sent to the Gentiles. Now those two examples alone show that Sha'ul always considered himself to be an emissary and sent by Yeshua to first the Jews and then also to the Gentiles who were being called by Yeshua. Therefore, as an emissary, the question must be asked, was he a 13th emissary? I believe the answer is no. There is no suggestion anywhere in the B'rit Hadashah that there would ever be 13 emissaries. So why did the 11, led by Kefa, immediately after the final ascension of Yeshua, select Mattityahu as a replacement for Yehuda ben Kariot, that is Judas? It appears that Kefa took the matters into his own hands and made a choice by casting lots over the two Talmudim who had been witnesses to the death and resurrection of Yeshua. In Acts chapter 1 verse 24 it says, they prayed, Lord, you know everyone's heart. Show us which of these two men we have chosen are to take the place of the work of the office of emissary. Having said those words, they then drew lots and decided to substitute Judas with the man called Mattityahu, and he was added to the 11, making 12 emissaries. While Kefa and the others may have felt comfortable at having established yet again the complete number, Yeshua, by contrast, was silent about the outcome because he had no part in the choice. Mattityahu is never mentioned again by name anywhere in the B'rit Hadashah, so it is highly doubtful that their selection was justifiable. Another important point is that the time of the selection was before the outpouring of the Ruach HaKodesh. If Yeshua had wanted Kefa and the others to select a replacement, why did he not express this desire before he departed? Further, when we consider how the original 12 were actually selected, we see that it was Yeshua who personally nominated all of them after spending a night in prayer with his Father. So we can see from the various scriptures that Sha'ul became the 12th emissary, following the call of Yeshua himself. Having been violently rejected by the brothers in the synagogue at both Damascus and again in Jerusalem, he disappeared off the scene for an unspecified period. That brings us to Acts chapter 9 verse 31, where the Messianic community throughout Yehuda and Galilee and the Shomron enjoyed peace and was built up. There they lived in fear or awe of the Master, and the numbers kept on multiplying. At that stage, Kefa began travelling around away from Yerushalayim for the first time since Shavuot, travelling through Lud, which is located about 40 kilometers northwest of Yerushalayim. There he found a man who had been bedridden for over 8 years. Again, when he healed him, the locals were so impressed with what Kefa had done and the abilities he had through Yeshua, they all began to believe. Meanwhile, in Jaffa, on the coast, just south of modern Tel Aviv, a Talmudir named Tabitha died. Then, hearing that Kefa had been healing in Lud, they sent for him, and upon arriving he kneeled and prayed by her body. And then he said, "In the name of Yeshua, get up." And she opened her eyes and sat up. Helping her to her feet, Kefa presented her to the other Talmudim. Yet again, many of the people, hearing what had occurred, came to believe in Yeshua and were added as Talmudim. Kefa stayed in Yaffo at the home of the tanner by the name of Shimon. That brings us to Acts chapter 10, where Luke records how the first Gentile was added to the Messianic community. While the number had been continually growing since the day in the temple court at Shavuot, those who had been coming and been called to become part of the Messianic community were all Jews. So what happened next was truly a quantum leap, because never before in the history of the Jewish community had a Gentile be accepted into their midst without the man having first been circumcised. Now in chapter 10, we are introduced to the grafting in of Cornelius, a Roman officer. As verse 2 says, he was a devout man, a God-fearer. He and his whole household gave generously to the Jewish poor and prayed regularly to Yahweh. That is why around the time of the Mincha prayers, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, while he was praying, an angel appeared with the words, "Your acts of charity have gone up to God, so that he has you on his mind. Now send some men to Yaffo and bring back the man called Simeon, also called Kefa." So began the great change. For the first time in the nation's history, Yahweh was allowing a Gentile to become part of Israel without going through the ritual conversion and circumcision. Not that Cornelius was asking to become a proselyte Jew, because that was totally impossible for a man of his position. As a Roman officer of the Italian regiment, he was a sworn enemy of the people of Yehuda. So there was no way he could become a proselyte Jew. Yet it was Yahweh who was bringing about this historical change. Now returning to chapter 10, verse 4 and onwards, we see that Cornelius stared at the angel, terrified. "What is it, sir?" he asked. "Your prayers," replied the angel, "and your acts of charity have gone up into the presence of God, so that God has you on his mind." Now that is an amazing statement from the angel of God, that Cornelius, a Gentile, was on the mind of God. That statement reflects as Yeshua has always wanted to have a relationship with human beings. What Yeshua was seeing in Cornelius was a man with whom he could have a particular relationship. It was the type of relationship that he had sought to have with Adam before the fall. It was the type of relationship that he had had with Abraham, Moshe, and David. Now it was the turn of a Roman army officer. Throughout the history of Israel, Yahweh had longed to have just such a relationship. And here he was now finding it among the Gentiles. So Cornelius was told to send his household slave and a military aide to seek the presence of Kefa. At the same time, Kefa, who had been staying in Yaffo, was also given a vision of the three men who were coming to look for him. Meanwhile, down in Kefa, around noon, Kefa was feeling hungry, and he fell into a trance, which must have been an angelic vision. Presented before him was a sheet containing various types of tray for unclean creatures, which no Torah-observant Jew would ever contemplate eating. Suddenly, it all appeared before his eyes. Kefa, get up, slaughter and eat. That was the message he received from the angel. Kefa responded in the only way he could, saying, "No, sir, absolutely not. I have never eaten food that was unclean or treif." That was the only answer Kefa could give. But even then, he was told 3 times by the same voice, "Stop treating as unclean what God has made clean." Kefa had never encountered anything like that before. Even when he had denied Yeshua 3 times during the trial, he had not broken a mitzvah or command of Torah. But now the voice was telling him to reject Torah. Mortified by what he was experiencing, Kefa saw the sheet fold up and ascend away into heaven. Still trying to reconcile all that he had experienced, the Ruach said to him, "Go downstairs, for there are 3 men at the gate." Realizing they were Roman servants, Kefa asked, "What brings you here?" They told him how they had come and been sent by Cornelius. Reluctantly, Kefa invited them into the house as guests. As inviting a Gentile into the house, a Jewish house, was another practice that was forbidden by Jewish custom. Even though the Torah called for Jewish people to be hospitable to foreigners, as they had also been foreigners in Egypt. But Kefa remained confused as to why the Ruach would encourage table fellowship between a Jew and a Gentile. It was not until the following day that they set off on the journey towards Caesarea. Kefa took with him 6 other Talmudim who were residents in Yaffo. Doubtless, he felt he needed support on such a strange mission. A day later, they arrived in Caesarea and went straight to the home of Cornelius, who was eagerly awaiting for them with close relatives and friends already there. As verse 25 says, Kefa entered the house and Cornelius met him and fell prostrate at his feet. But Kefa pulled him up to his feet and said, "Stand up, I myself am just a man." Still unaware of what God was doing, Kefa entered the house, and verse 25 onwards it says, "You are well aware that for a man who is a Jew to have close association with someone belonging to another people, or to come in and visit with him, is something that just isn't done. But God has shown me that not to call a person common or unclean. So when I was summoned, I came without raising a question." Cornelius then described all that had happened at the time of the Mincha prayers, when the angel had appeared to him. Finally, Kefa began to understand the full significance of all that was happening. He realized the message behind the sheet of unclean creatures, and then Kefa said, "Now I understand that God does not play favorites. But whoever he fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him, no matter whether he is a Jew or a Gentile." Kefa concluded his explanation about all that had transpired by saying in verse 42 to 43, "He, Yeshua, commanded us to proclaim and to attest to the Jewish people that this man had been appointed by God to be a judge of both the living and the dead. All the prophets bear witness to him that everyone who puts trust in him receives forgiveness for his sins in his name. But now Yeshua also is extending that message beyond just the Jewish world. He is also calling selected Gentiles to become part of the body of the one new man." Those words of Kefa amazed all present, particularly the Talmudim who were actually traveling with Kefa as his support team. They particularly were amazed that while Kefa was still speaking, the Ruach came down and poured upon Cornelius and his household. One by one, Cornelius and the members of the household began to speak in tongues, praising God. As the Talmudim understood what they were saying, it suggests that they were speaking in languages that were known to the witnesses. All that occurred even before Cornelius or his family had been immersed. So Kefa concluded by saying, "Is anyone here prepared to prevent these people from being immersed in water? After all, we have received the Ruach HaKodesh, just as they have received the Ruach HaKodesh, just as we did." And he ordered them to be immersed in the name of Yeshua, the Messiah. So that brings us to the end of chapter 10, and with the first family of the Gentiles firmly embedded into the Messianic community. But that is the last we hear of Cornelius and his family. He certainly did not give up his position as an officer in the Roman army, nor did he and his family embark on any outreach towards the Jews or the Gentiles. So with that in mind, we can now look at chapter 11, where Kefa and his supporting team of Talmudim returned to Yerushalayim, because the message about Cornelius had spread widely among the brothers and also reached the emissaries back in Yerushalayim. Because up until the time of Cornelius, all the emissaries and the Talmudim were all circumcised Jews. Luke and the original manuscripts would have said something like, when Kefa went up to Yerushalayim, the members of the Hebrew-speaking faction criticized him, because they were the ones whom we saw earlier had shown adversity towards the inclusion of the Greek-speaking Jews into the fledgling Messianic community. As we see in chapter 6, verse 1, around this time, when the number of Talmudim was growing, the Greek-speaking Jews complained against those who spoke Hebrew that their widows were being overlooked in the daily portions. The factional problem that developed within the early Messianic community was clearly between the Greek and the Hebrew-speaking Jews. To verses 4 through 17, Kefa explains all that occurred in relationship to upon Cornelius coming to believe and the sheet of unclean creatures he had been instructed to kill and eat. On hearing these things, they stopped objecting and began to praise God, saying, "This means that God has enabled the Goyim as well to do teshuvah, that is, repent and have life." What he had shared meant that they had to face a complete paradigm shift. They were faced with a number of challenging questions. How could a Gentile receive the Ruach HaKodesh without first being circumcised? The world, these Jewish believers, had been turned upside down. Neither Kefa nor the other Talmudim fully understood just what had happened. What they did not realize was that the moment of Yeshua's death, the wall of partition between the outer and the inner court of the temple had been destroyed by the earthquake. Not only did it bring the authority of the Sanhedrin to a crashing end, but it also paved the way for selected Gentiles to become as one with Jews. The confusion among the emissaries and the Talmudim in Yerushalayim must have been overwhelming. But Luke makes no further reference to the situation in Yerushalayim among both the emissaries and the Talmudim. Instead, he again changes direction. In verses 19 through 21, Luke reflects back to the impact of the stoning of Stephen and what the impact it had on the Messianic community in Yerushalayim and how they scattered to many parts of the Roman diaspora. Then he focuses on Antioch, because the men who left Yerushalayim in haste following the stoning of Stephen were Greek-speaking Jews who would not be speaking to Gentiles, but rather they would be speaking to Greek-speaking Jews in Antioch. So having initially been in Yerushalayim for the observance of Pesach and Shavuot, those same Greek-speaking Jews would have normally returned home via Antioch immediately after Shavuot. But of course, having accepted the message about Yeshua and having been filled with the Ruach HaKodesh, they stayed on in Yerushalayim until the stoning of Stephen. So considering that they had left Yerushalayim in haste, it may well have been winter when they arrived in Antioch, and they would have been lodging over with the Messianic community in the various local synagogues. If that is true, they would have been speaking not to Gentiles, but rather to the Jewish brothers. They would have been sharing about what they had received in Yerushalayim. Because as Torah-observant Jews, they would have had no fellowship with the local Gentiles. However, as verse 21 says, the hand of the Master, Yeshua, was on them, and a great number of people trusted and turned towards the Mashiach. Then, in verses 22 to 24, the news of this reached the ears of the Messianic community in Yerushalayim. So they sent Barnabas to Antioch. On arriving, he saw for himself the grace of God's work and was glad and encouraged by what he saw and what the Master was doing through the Ruach HaKodesh. What we're seeing here is because of the stoning of Stephen and latterly the call placed upon Cornelius as a righteous Gentile, Yeshua, through the Ruach HaKodesh, was expanding and spreading the message in many different directions, as he said he would, and how it would occur. Just at the time when he was departing for the last time, he said, "You will be my witnesses, both in Yerushalayim and Yehuda and Shomron, indeed to the ends of the earth." Recapping on the words we've seen, we see that the work of the emissaries had first reached many of the Greek-speaking Jews, as well as among the Hebrew-speaking Jews who were in Yerushalayim itself. As a direct result of the murder of Stephen, the community was forced to venture firstly to the regions of Yehuda and Shomron, and now, of course, even as far as Antioch. The fear of persecution was the primary driver of the dispersion from the comfort of being in Yerushalayim. Meanwhile, the new focal point for the Greek-speaking Jews of the community became Antioch. The Greek Talmudim were teaching about Yeshua, but as we saw earlier, when Philip, one of the seven, started teaching and healing in Shomron, Kefa and Yochanan had to step in to assist him, because he was becoming overwhelmed with the responsibility of sharing the newfound message. So the same pattern appears to be happening in Antioch, because when the emissaries in Yerushalayim heard about it, they dispatched Barnabas. When Barnabas arrived in Antioch, he was delighted to see for himself what God was doing. He acted in the role of exhorter by encouraging all those who were remaining steadfast in their truth and knowledge and trust in the newfound belief in Yeshua the Master. As Luke says about Barnabas, he was a good man, full of the Ruach HaKodesh and trust. He certainly was the right man for that job. But then in verse 25, there was a strong suggestion that even he realized the depth and responsibility of what had been placed upon him. So Barnabas, aware of these things, went off to Caesarea in search of Sha'ul. Having found him, took him back to Antioch and together they led the newly forming Messianic community for a whole year and teaching a sizable crowd about Yeshua. However, the character of the community, as portrayed in the last sentence of verse 26 in most translations, uses the word similar to the example used in the New King James Version. And the disciples were the first to be called Christians in Antioch. There is no way the title Christian would have been used at that stage, because Christianity did not exist until well after 70 CE. Only beyond that time did the Gentile believers begin to dominate the Messianic community in Antioch. Further, there is no suggestion anywhere that the non-believing Jews at any stage used that title in Antioch. To the non-believing Jews, the Messianic community was always called the Nazarene, because they were followers of the man from Nazareth. That last sentence in verse 26 is either an addition to the original manuscript or another attempt by the church fathers to move the focus away from the Jewish origin of the Messianic community. Luke, as a close confidant of Sha'ul, would never have used the word Christian in his original manuscript. So the changes must have occurred during the compilation of the Christian New Testament, which was finally canonized in 325 CE. So coming back to the end of chapter 11, we see there's a reference to a severe famine that was due to strike the Roman Empire. The time placed for the famine was during the reign of Cornelius, which lasted between 41 and 54 CE. So considering another statement by Sha'ul in Galatians chapter 2 verse 1, he said then that it was 14 years between his visits to Yerushalayim. That puts the timing teaching in Antioch as possibly around 50 CE, meaning that the death of Stephen and the call of Sha'ul would have occurred around 33 CE, which seems to make reasonable sense and fit in logically with the time frames. All that brings us to the end of chapter 11, with Sha'ul and Barnea setting off on a journey to Yerushalayim with the famine relief contributions from the Antioch community. So what I want you to take away from today is the realization that the development of the first century Messianic community happened slowly over the full 40-year period from the death of Yeshua in 30 CE right through to the destruction of the Second Temple. The development was truly to the Jew first, but not only to the Jew, it is also given to the Gentile, because they could become members of the Messianic community by invitation of the Ruach HaKodesh. Then they became part of the national life of Israel. However, becoming part of the community did not require them to be circumcised. A very important detail that we will consider more deeply in the coming weeks as we go through the rest of the book of Acts and some of the letters of Sha'ul. At no stage did Yeshua ever abandon his people and pass on the mantle of responsibility to anyone in the Gentile world. There is nothing in the B'rit Hadashah to suggest that the commission originally given to the 11 emissaries at Yeshua's final departure would pass on to the Gentiles. Therefore, the claims made by the churches of Christendom that the Torah was nailed to the stake is totally unjustified, as there is nothing in Scripture to justify that teaching. As we have seen so far, it has always been Kefa who passed on the call to new people. Firstly, to the Jewish men present in the temple court on the day of Shavuot. Then to Cornelius and his family, He opened the door for the Gentile world to come into the national life of Israel. Even though Yeshua had said that Sha'ul would be his chosen instrument to take the message to the Goyim, we see it was always Kefa who first opened the door. That was because it was Kefa alone whom Yeshua had said, "You are Kefa," which means the rock. "And on this rock I will build my community." The reason Yeshua said those words is because of Kefa's response to a question Yeshua had asked just before that. Because he'd said to the 12, "Who do you say I am?" Shimon Kefa answered, "You are the Mashiach, the Son of the living God." Yeshua said to him, "How blessed are you! No human being revealed this to you. It was my Father in heaven who said it." Yahweh had placed his hand upon Kefa. To him that Yeshua gave the keys to the kingdom. So he alone could open the door for Cornelius to become part of the national life of Israel in the truest sense, without the need to be circumcised. However, as we saw, Barnabas, a much-loved Talmud, realized how fast things were growing in Antioch when he searched for Sha'ul. Barnabas realized he needed that 12th emissary to take responsibility for the welfare of the Antioch community. As we will see in the next few chapters of Acts, that having paved the way, Kefa progressively takes a lesser role as Sha'ul steps up as the leading emissary. He is the one who stretched out towards the various Gentiles in the wider Roman diaspora. So next week our focus will return to Kefa and his encounters with King Herod Agrippa, a grandson of Herod the Great, through the Jewish Hasmonean family. So until then, as always, Shabbat Shalom.